In the last hour before dawn on August 19, 1779, a British sentry on the causeway at Paulus Hook heard men moving through the marsh. He was not alarmed. His own garrison had sent a foraging party into the countryside the day before, and here, surely, were those men coming home. So he did what a tired soldier does at 4 in the morning. He assumed the best. He would be dead or a prisoner within the quarter hour. Standing less than a mile from the headquarters of the largest army in the world, a 23-year-old Virginian was about to attack one of Britain's strongest outposts in America, on foot, with soaked gunpowder, and with no intention whatsoever of keeping the ground he took. He had not marched 14 miles through the dark to capture a fort. He had marched to capture a humiliation. Welcome to our video on the raid on Paulus Hook, one of the most audacious small operations of the American Revolution. Paulus Hook was a low, sandy peninsula on the western bank of the Hudson River, a place that today lies buried beneath the streets of downtown Jersey City. In 1779, it was something far more dangerous. A fortified British fist thrust across the water, directly opposite Manhattan. From its ramparts, a man could see the spires of New York City. The Royal Navy rode at anchor within signal distance. British headquarters, the nerve center of Sir Henry Clinton's war, stood roughly 3/4 of a mile away, across a stretch of river that a rowing boat could cross in minutes. Nowhere in America was British power more concentrated or more visible. The irony was that the Americans had built the place themselves. In 1776, on Washington's orders and under the supervision of General William Alexander, the man the rebels called Lord Sterling, patriot laborers had raised the first works at Paulus Hook to guard the Hudson. They did not hold it long. That September, after the disaster on Long Island shattered Washington's army and the British seized New York, the garrison abandoned the post and fell back inland. Paulus Hook thus earned a grim distinction. It became the first patch of New Jersey soil occupied by the British Crown. And the British did not merely occupy it, they perfected it. Over 3 years, they cut a moat clean across the neck of the peninsula, a tidal ditch that flooded with the river. They threw a single drawbridge across it, the only way in by land. Beyond the bridge, they planted a dense abatis, a barrier of felled trees, with their sharpened branches aimed outward like spears. Behind that stood redoubts bristling with cannon, 2 blockhouses, and a powder magazine. On 3 sides, water and marsh. On the 4th, a causeway that could be crossed only at low tide. To attack Paulus Hook, in short, was to walk a narrow path in the open toward loaded guns in the shadow of the enemy's capital. Sane officers did not propose it. There was one more reason the place festered in patriot minds. The garrison was not made up of distant redcoats, but of loyalists, Americans in British service, the New Jersey Volunteers, commanded by a Bergen County man named Lieutenant Colonel Abraham Van Buskirk. From Paulus Hook, Van Buskirk's men rode out to plunder, to burn, and to carry off the farmers of the Hackensack Valley, their own former neighbors. To the Whigs of New Jersey, Paulus Hook was not a fort. It was the address of the men tormenting them. And revenge, when it came, would come from a most unlikely direction. The idea that Paulus Hook could be taken at all was born a month earlier and 40 miles up the river. By the summer of 1779, the war in the North had congealed into a stalemate. Clinton held New York and would not leave it. Washington could not force him out. Both armies circled and watched. And the great question was whether the Continentals, even now, 4 years into the war, could actually storm a prepared British position and win. On July 16th, they answered it. In a night assault of astonishing discipline, General Anthony Wayne led a hand-picked corps of light infantry against the British fort at Stony Point. His men attacked with a doctrine that would define the summer. They went in with unloaded muskets and fixed bayonets. Flints removed. No shot to give away the advance. No volley to halt the rush. Only cold steel and silence in the dark.
Surrender!
Stony Point fell in under half an hour. Watching all of this, and indeed having personally scouted the ground beforehand, was Major Henry Lee. Virginia-born, a graduate of the College of New Jersey, the school we now call Princeton, Lee was 23 years old and already something of a legend among the cavalry. His horsemanship had earned him a nickname that would follow him into history: Light Horse Harry. He had known George Washington in Virginia before the war, and Washington trusted him. Lee looked at Wayne's triumph and saw not an ending, but a template. If Stony Point could be stormed, why not Paulus Hook? Why not strike the enemy in the very shadow of his headquarters and prove that no British post anywhere was safe? He took the plan to Washington. Washington said no. The commander-in-chief was not a timid man, but he could count. The target sat under the guns of New York. A repulse would mean the annihilation of the raiding force with no possible rescue. It was, on its face, a reckless gamble for a fort that could not even be held. But Lee returned with an answer to the objection. He would not try to hold it. He would strike, take prisoners, and vanish. And, to guarantee the escape, he arranged for boats to be waiting on the Hackensack River to spirit his men away before the British could react. The boats were the hinge of the whole design. Reassured, Washington relented and gave his consent. Remember the boats. They matter later, and not in the way Lee hoped. On the evening of August 18, 1779, Major Lee assembled roughly 400 men near Newbridge in New Jersey, his own legion of dismounted dragoons, stiffened by Virginia and Maryland infantry. Ahead of them lay a march of some 14 miles through woods and swamp to reach the peninsula. The plan called for the assault to fall near midnight, in the deepest part of the night. Lee began with a piece of theater. He had his men set out alongside empty wagons, so that any watching eyes would read the column as a routine foraging expedition, trundling off to strip the local farms, an ordinary sight, worth no messenger's ride to warn the garrison. It was a clever deception, and it would be rewarded by a coincidence Lee could not have known about. For at almost the same hour, out of Paulus Hook, Lieutenant Colonel Van Buskirk was marching in the opposite direction. He had taken roughly 130 of his loyalists into the countryside on a raid of his own, hunting the very rebels who were, at that moment, marching to sack his fort. The tormentor of Bergen County had left his own door open and gone out looking for the people about to walk through it. His departure left only some 250 men behind the walls, under the command of a major named William Sutherland. So much we and right. Then, in the darkness, almost everything began to go wrong. Size. The trouble was the guide. Somewhere in the woods near Union Hill, the man leading Lee's column lost the road. Whether through simple fear or something closer to treachery, the sources have never settled. What is certain is the cost. The march that should have flowed straight to the target instead wandered for hours, and the long column came apart in the black timber. Lee lost contact with a body of roughly 200 Virginia troops, half his striking force swallowed by the night. By the time he could take stock, the schedule was in ruins. The midnight assault was gone. It was creeping toward 3 in the morning, and Lee stood at the edge of the marsh with perhaps 300 men, perhaps fewer, the accounts differ, staring at a problem the darkness had made worse. Exhales sharply, because the tide was coming in. The causeway and the ditch that guarded Paulus Hook were passable only at low water. Every minute Lee delayed, the river climbed higher across his single road in, and dawn, which would strip away his one advantage, surprise, drew nearer. A prudent officer, halved in strength, hours behind schedule, with the tide turning against him and daylight coming, would have called it off. Every reason said, turn back. Lee weighed all of it and gave the order to go forward. At around 3 o'clock in the morning, Lee's column reached Pryor's Mill, the last cover before the open ground. Half an hour later, they stood at the edge of the tidal ditch, near what is today the corner of Newark Avenue and Warren Street. The water was rising and dark. There was no time to search for a better crossing, and no better crossing to find. Here the operation came down, as these things so often do, to a handful of men willing to go first. In the language of the age, they were called the Forlorn Hope, the volunteers who lead a storming party into the teeth of the defense, and who, by grim tradition, are the least likely to come back. 2 young lieutenants, Michael Rudolph and Archibald McAllister took that place at the front. Rudolph found the ditch fordable and led the vanguard down into it. The men waded in up to their chests through the cold, brackish water, holding their muskets above their heads, and as they climbed the far bank, they discovered what the crossing had cost them. Their powder was soaked, the guns were useless. Whatever happened next would be settled exactly as at Stony Point, with the bayonet alone. It was enough, because the garrison made the one mistake that doomed it. Sentries saw armed men emerging from the dark and reached for the comforting explanation. This was Van Buskirk's foraging party, come home at last. By the time anyone understood that the men swarming the abattis wore no friendly colors, the Americans were already through the fell. Lee had split his remaining force into columns, striking from more than one direction, and they hit the works almost without a shot fired. The outer defenses that had taken the British 3 years to build were overrun in minutes. Surprise, silence, and steel did in a quarter of an hour what artillery might not have done in a day. Inside the fort, confusion became rout. The defenders, roused from sleep to find bayonets already among them, had no chance to form a line. Dozens were cut down or seized where they stood, and here the raid revealed its true character, because Lee's men were not there to kill, they were there to collect. The garrison began surrendering in droves, herded together in the dark, and the tally of prisoners climbed past 100 and kept climbing. But not everyone folded. Major Sutherland, the officer left holding the post, gathered a knot of his men and fell back into one of the small redoubts, a strong point garrisoned by most accounts with around 40 Hessians. From behind its walls, they refused every demand to surrender. Lee now faced the cruelest arithmetic of the night. The sky to the east was beginning to grey. To dig Sutherland out would take time he did not have, and time was the one thing the rising sun was stealing from him. Lee made a decision that tells you as much about the man as any charge across a ditch. He left Sutherland alone. The 40 Hessians in their redoubt were not worth the minutes it would cost to take them, and Lee had already won what he came for. But there was a second temptation, and it was greater. The barracks of Paulus Hook stood before him, and to burn them would turn a raid into a spectacle. A pillar of fire visible across the water in New York itself, a humiliation Clinton could watch from his own windows. Every instinct of war said put it to the torch. Lee went to look inside first, and inside the barracks he found sick soldiers too ill to stand, and women and children, the families that shadowed every 18th century garrison. To fire the buildings was to burn them alive. Lee gave the order to leave the barracks standing. In the middle of the enemy's fortress, with dawn breaking and his own survival hanging on speed, he chose restraint over a victory bonfire. It is a choice we will see honored in bronze and Latin before this story ends. By now, the raid had run its course. Lee had achieved something close to the impossible. He had stormed a fortified British post within sight of enemy headquarters and taken, by the most cited count, 158 prisoners, including 7 to 9 officers. British killed and wounded ran to roughly 50. His own losses were almost unbelievably light. 2 men killed, 3 wounded, and a handful, around 7, taken or lost. Most of them stragglers swallowed by that same treacherous darkness that had nearly wrecked the march. He had his prisoners, he had his triumph. What he did not have, he was about to discover, was a way home. The boats that had persuaded Washington to approve the entire enterprise, were not where they were supposed to be. And the sun was up. The plan had been elegant. Strike before midnight, march to the Hackensack River, board the waiting boats at Dow's Ferry, and be gone across the water before New York could stir. Nearly every assumption behind that plan had already collapsed. The assault had come hours late, and when Lee's exhausted, prisoner-laden column turned toward the river, they found the ferry empty. The boats had been moved to Newark. Consider Lee's position in the full light of that August morning. His ammunition was ruined, drowned in the ditch. His men had marched 14 miles and fought a battle without sleep. he was burdened with more than 150 prisoners who had every reason to hope for rescue. He stood on the wrong side of open country, within striking distance of the largest garrison on the continent, with dawn exposing his every move. The escape route was gone. The only way back to safety at Newbridge was to march the same 14 brutal miles overland, slowly, in daylight, straight through ground the British could reach from New York by boat in an afternoon. So he marched. Captain Forsyth was pushed out to Bergen Heights to cover the withdrawal. In one small human detail of that morning, a local girl out searching for a stray cow stumbled into the covering party and was politely detained, lest she carry word of them to the enemy. And then the pursuit Lee had dreaded began to close in. Sutherland sortied from his redoubt with his Hessians. Van Buskirk's loyalists, returning from their own raid to find their fort gutted, came onto the trail of the retreating column, hungry to recover the prisoners and salvage their pride. Lee was saved, in the end, by the wisdom of the man who had built the fort in the first place. Lord Stirling had not left the operation to chance. Fresh troops were fed into the line of retreat at exactly the moments they were needed. At Weehawken, Captain Catlett came up with 50 men and, crucially, good, dry ammunition. Further on, at the Fort Lee Road, Colonel Ball arrived with 200 fresh soldiers and took over as rear guard. When Van Buskirk's pursuers finally pressed the column, they ran not into a broken, powderless rabble, but into disciplined reinforcements who met them with sharp volleys. The Loyalists, seeing the rescue party's strength, broke off. The gamble held. At around 1 o'clock in the afternoon on August 19th, Major Henry Lee marched into Newbridge with his prisoners and his men. The soldiers, who had been awake and moving and fighting for the better part of a day and a night, simply collapsed. The raid was over. In the plain, satisfied summary handed down to us from the time, the English were greatly annoyed and the Americans exceedingly jubilant. Both halves of that sentence were about to grow much larger. The news of Paulus Hook traveled fast, and it landed like a tonic on a war-weary cause. Coming barely a month after Stony Point, the raid proved that the summer's first triumph had been no fluke. Continental soldiers had now twice stormed prepared positions held by British and Hessian regulars, and this time within 3/4 of a mile of the enemy's own headquarters. The message to Clinton was unmistakable and unwelcome. No isolated post, however strong, however close to home, was beyond the rebels' reach. Washington wrote to Congress in warm terms, praising Lee's prudence, address, and bravery, and calling the success brilliant, given how critical the attempt had been. Congress went further still. On the 24th of September, it passed a cascade of formal resolutions. Thanks to Washington for ordering the stroke, thanks to Lord Stirling for arranging the retreat, thanks to the officers and men for their conduct in the march, the action, and the retreat. It singled out Lieutenants McAllister and Rudolph, who had led the Forlorn Hope, and rewarded them with brevet promotions. It voted $15,000 to be shared among the men who had made the raid, and it resolved that a gold medal be struck in Major Lee's honor. That medal is the measure of the thing. Across the entire Revolutionary War, Congress awarded such a gold medal to only a small handful of men, and Henry Lee was the only officer below the rank of general ever to receive one. Its Latin inscription praised him for conquering the enemy despite rivers and entrenchments, and, this above all, for binding the conquered to him by his humanity. The decision not to burn those barracks had become a line on a medal of gold. And then, having been crowned by his country, Lee was put on trial by his own army. For all its glory, Paulus Hook had left a residue of jealousy. Lee was young, favored by Washington, and rising fast, and there were officers who resented every inch of it. A dispute over command, who had properly outranked whom on the expedition, and whether Lee had shaded the date of his commission to claim precedence, hardened into formal charges. 8 of them: usurping command from a superior, misconduct, retreating too soon. Lee, fresh from the greatest triumph of his young life, spent 5 days defending himself before a court-martial. In one of the affair's stranger turns, even the rival officer at the center of the quarrel testified on Lee's behalf. The court dismissed the charges as groundless and acquitted him with honor on every count, praising the very conduct his accusers had impugned. 2 weeks later, Congress passed its commendation. The reward for winning had been a reckoning. He survived both. It would be easy and wrong to call Paulus Hook a decisive victory. Let us be honest about what it was and was not. Lee had not conquered the fort. He could not and never meant to. Within days, the British marched fresh troops back onto the peninsula, repaired the works, and held Paulus Hook until the final evacuation of New York in 1783. On the map, nothing changed. The cannon still pointed across the Hudson. The drawbridge still rose and fell over the tidal ditch. In the narrowest accounting, a great deal of daring had won a night's possession of ground that was handed straight back. But wars are not fought only on maps, and Paulus Hook was never about ground. It was about the two things Lee set out to take, and did: prisoners and pride. 158 men marched into captivity from a post the British believed untouchable, and the humiliation reached exactly where Lee intended it to reach. The greatest army in the world had been robbed in its own front yard, in the dark, by a force half of which had gotten lost in the woods on the way. Together with Stony Point, the raid helped convince Clinton that his grip on the North was less secure than he had imagined, one of the currents that, the following year, would carry the main British war effort away from New York and down into the South, into the Carolinas, and toward its eventual ruin. And there is a final, quiet irony worth marking. The loyalist colonel who used Paulus Hook to terrorize his neighbors, Abraham Van Buskirk, had been out raiding rebels on the very night the rebels raided him, and came home to find his fortress emptied and his name a punchline. The tormentor of Bergen County had, for once, been on the wrong end of a midnight surprise. Paulus Hook was a small raid. It changed no border and toppled no government. But it announced, louder than any pitched battle could, that the men Britain had once dismissed as a rabble could now strike anywhere, even in the shadow of the enemy's own capital, and vanish into the dark before the sun rose, and that Britain's confidence in America was beginning, quietly, to slip away. We hope you enjoyed this journey into one of the boldest small operations of the Revolution. More videos on the war for American independence are on the way, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell so you don't miss them. If you enjoyed this, a like, a comment and a share help the channel more than you know. We'll catch you on the next one.